Welcome to class number 13, and this is the second to last class in this series. So till now, we discussed the foundation of Torah law, how it came from the Torah to the Mishnah and eventually the Talmud. The last two are really very applicable to nowadays, our times. How is it that there's different opinions when we have a basic question that comes up? If we're following one God, one Torah, where does all the different opinions come in and what are they basing it on? So this is a really interesting class because we'll use an example that plagued or it came about because of the coronavirus. So a lot of halachic questions come up, and it was big debates, big differences of opinions within the halachic Jewish world as to how do we go about the new way of life and integrating it with the previous established Jewish law. So let's start with the beginning and to start with the introduction. Aliyah, if you'd like to read.
Lesson 13, how to be basic Jewish fundamentals in the modern world. Introduction. In previous lessons, we learned how comprehensive the halachic system is, but the Talmud was written about 1,500 years ago, and since then, modern technology was developed in extraordinary ways. Horse-drawn wagons and flimsy ships have been replaced with airplanes and cars. We have even sent man to the moon. How does a halachic ruling extrapolated so many years ago apply to these modern scenarios? Is the halakha system outdated?
Very good. So this is the introduction, which is a great question. Many will say, incorrectly, in our opinion, that halakha doesn't have what to say regarding today's day and age. As time develops and as society gets more modern, we have to come up with our own conclusions, give our own ideas, put in our own input. Judaism, for the first part of this class, will start with laying the foundation that we believe that halakha is timeless. So let's start with big idea number one, to set aside that notion that we have to change Jewish law to fit the times. We believe, on the contrary, halakha, the Jewish law, stays the same, and we just have to see how to connect it with the times and with the modern advances that society is making. So we'll start with idea number one, and then 2 and 3 will go into practical examples. So Sheila, if you'd like to read big idea number one, this section, and then I'll scroll down for the next piece.
Halakha is timeless. Halakha is comprehensive and eternal. It is equally relevant in the 21st century as it was a millennium ago.
Very good. Okay, so let's read over here the first text, which is going to bring out the point that you just read. This is a quote from the Torah, what Moses tells the Jewish people a little before he passes away. Okay, Sheila, please read.
The Torah is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven and bring it to us, so that we can hear it and do it. Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who shall go over the sea and bring it to us and make us hear it so that we may do it. Rather, the matter is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it.
So Moses is laying here a beautiful foundation. And he says, if someone were to come to you and say, the Torah is too difficult for you to understand, it's too complex, too hard, it's not relatable, it's like traveling to a foreign country to access the Torah, Moses says they're mistaken. The Torah is extremely accessible, and that is exactly the reason why God gave us the Torah. So it should be something that we can look into and derive lessons from on a day-to-day basis, which is also why sometimes people say, oh, I found this new guy. He has this new way of serving God that we never heard of before. It's beautiful. It's magnificent. And we tell ourselves, well, if God wanted us to do that, why wouldn't he not write this thousands of years ago in the Torah that he gave us with clear directives? Why would he hide it in a place where no one knows where it is? God wants it to be the most accessible, explainable, understandable as possible. And that's why the Torah is the most printed book in history, the book that was also banned the most, but also printed the most, because it is supposed to be something really available, readily available to everyone in every situation. Let's read over here. And Caroline, if you'd like to read text number 2.
Okay, text number 2. I believe with perfect faith that this Torah is given to be observed, realized, and fully carried out in every place and at all times, within every social, economic, and cultural framework, in every technological circumstance, and every political condition. This ani ma'amin principle of faith was formulated by Moses, our teacher, during his last day on earth, when he parted from the children of Israel who are about to pass from the nomadic desert existence into life in Israel. For this commandment, which I command you today, is not too hard for you, nor is it too far off. Rather, it is very close to you, not only those who eat manna and are protected by the clouds of glory, but also those who enter the land will have to grapple with desolation and organize society within the framework of independent statehood, are able to observe Torah.
Very good. So he clarifies over here that this, he calls it ani ma'amin, which is a principle of faith, I believe, not to confuse with the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides writes. This is not an exact one. It's relatable to one of them, that we believe that the Torah is never changing. Based on that principle, he says, you have to believe that the Torah applies in every situation. Because, as we'll explain later, who made the changes in society? It's God that changes everything. And God is the one that gave us the Torah. So if it was another author that wrote the Torah and another creator that's changing society, you can say there might be a break in their communication and not necessarily is it applicable. However, if it's the same author that's also the creator, so of course, his book, which he tells us in the book will never change, and it's always accessible, must be that in every situation, it gives us the same lessons as before. Now let's continue. This is again from Rabbi Soloveitchik, and Elia, if you'd like to read, continue with text 2b.
Rabbi Soloveitchik proceeds to explain how this rule rejects two mistaken notions about the eternity of Torah. Theory number 1, or entirety. I don't know, eternity. Sorry, I'm having a slow day today. This ani ma'amin principle of faith negates two theories which seem at first sight distant from one another. On the one hand, it rejects all the experiments of those who would improve religion, reformers by half, third, or quarter measure, who claim that halakha is in its totality is unsuitable for our social, scientific, industrial framework, and that we must trim the branches in order to save the trunk. The ani ma'amin, which says, but the word is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it, determines that the halakha is always actual and valid.
Very good. So he says, number 1, to take away from the idea that we have to enhance it, make it better by not explaining it, but by trimming away. He said that's one mistaken notion. And let's read text 2c. Sheila, if you'd like to please read it.
However, the ani ma'amin of the word is very close to you also rejects a further theory that separation from the world is the only way to observe Torah. In other words, those who uphold this theory of complete isolation admit by their silence the position of the reformers to the effect that within the modern cultural historical constellation, the observance of mitzvah and the study of Torah are almost impossible. In their heart of hearts, they also lack the recognition that Torah was given for practice within all the social changes and meanderings to which a dynamic society that is constantly on the move, like a mighty stream is subject. While the reforms choose one solution, the adherents of isolation adopts an opposite solution. We reject that theory of isolation as dangerous for the continued existence of the Jewish people. The force of circumstances of recent years that led to the majority of the Jewish people being moved to the West and becoming connected language-wise, economically, and politically, with socially in general, has rendered the approach of the isolationist suicidal. In such an approach lurks the danger that we shall dwindle to a small sect with little life expectancy. Can't read the rest.
There you go.
We solemnly declare that the principle of the eternity of the Torah bestows upon us the promise that it is possible to study Torah and to observe it not only at home and in the ghetto, but everywhere in the world, be it the modern home, the laboratory, the campus, or the industrial plant, in public as well as in private life.
Very good. So to summarize what he said, both extremes are wrong. Those that say that we have to change the Torah, and those that say that we have to ignore society and we have to abandon it because if we get involved with society, we'll have to leave the Torah, and therefore we must isolate ourselves from the world. He says the Torah is not scared of the changes in society. The Torah is there to teach us how to approach it in a Jewish and proper way. So therefore, we have to keep with the strong values of the Torah, and at the same time, be willing to adapt and be willing to acknowledge that there are changes in society, which the Torah tells us how to adapt to them. Okay, let's continue over here. Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Okay. We know God permits or prohibits. For example, we know that God does not want us to kindle a fire on Shabbat. But what about light bulbs? What about LED lights? There are clearly no Talmudic sources that directly relate to these situations. Example, electricity. There is much discussion regarding the status of electricity on Shabbat. In 1991, Rabbi Michael Broide, a professor at Emory University, and Rabbi Howard Yachner, a noted American halakhic authority and a member of the Beth Din of America, published an article that surveys the issues and opinions. In the introduction to the article, they define the job of modern poesk as taking timeless legal principles of the Talmud and applying them to new technologies that the Talmudic sages themselves could not have guessed would emerge.
So to clarify, what he's saying is, we're using an example of electricity. Of course, in the times of the Torah or the times of the Talmud, electricity, to be accurate, existed, but we didn't know how to harvest it. We didn't know how to use it. And therefore, there is no discussion in the Torah, is one allowed to turn on a light on Shabbat? It discusses a fire, which was prevalent then. However, it's not that the Torah doesn't have what to say. It's the job of one that studies the Torah well to say, in the Torah, I have the foundations of how to study each and every development in society. And it's my job to say, how can I compare a new scenario that comes my way, for example, electricity, to previously what was discussed in the Torah and the Talmud, to figure out what would be Jewish law regarding electricity. So not every form of light is the same. And the Torah does discuss light regarding certain aspects. For example, Shabbat, that's the easy one that everybody brings up. The Torah prohibits lighting a fire on Shabbat. So then the discussion is, what exactly is a fire and what exactly is electricity? And therefore we could discuss, does electricity fall under the same category as fire or not? And then when LEDs come out, we say, are LEDs just like the regular electricity, or do they operate differently? And therefore they cannot be compared exactly the same to fire. So to clarify, again, even if you won't find the word an exact reference, but you find the foundations with which one can eventually extrapolate the laws regarding new scenarios. So let's read their article inside. And Caroline, if you'd like to continue, text number 3.
Text number 3, Rabbi Michael Broide, a rabbi, and Rabbi Howard Yachner, the use of electricity on Shabbat and Yom Tov, Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society, number 21, spring 1991, Pesach 5751. The advances of technology have posed practical challenges to decisors throughout the ages. One of the hallmarks of Jewish law is its ability and desire to assimilate technological advances into the practices of observant Jews. The application of ancient and venerated principles of halacha to new situations has been and remains one of the essential tasks of modern decisors of Jewish law. In the last 100 years, this task has become considerably more difficult due to the rapid and frequent changes and state of technology.
Beautiful. So again, he clarifies this idea using the idea of electricity. Who invented electricity? The answer is God created and therefore invented electricity. Later on, people discovered how to use electricity in a beneficial way. So if God created electricity, and he is also the one that gave us the laws, clearly he has laws regarding how he wants us to view the electricity. He was well aware of it because he created it. Or in other words, science doesn't invent anything. Science simply discovers what was already there since the beginning of creation. So therefore, the Torah of God definitely is eternal. It lasts forever and it has what to give us a lesson and a message in every situation, including new discoveries that come about in later generations. So even though God doesn't reveal himself openly and say, oh, there's an update in society, let me give you an updated Torah in order to be compatible with the changes in society. Rather, God says, I was the one that created the changes in society. It's all in the Torah. Our job is to see where is it that we can compare it to previous ideas in the Torah, which we'll get into in sections 2 and 3 of the class. But this was just idea number 1, that the Torah is eternal, that halachic Jewish law lasts forever. So if you'd like to read the summary, Sheila.
We have covered big idea number 1. Halakha is comprehensive and eternal. It is equally relevant in the 21st century as it was a millennium ago.
Beautiful. Okay, let's move on to section number 2. And here we'll use a practical thing, which we're using right now, something that everybody became aware of because of COVID. Let's start with Eliyav. If you'd like to read the introduction.
To Zoom or not to Zoom? Big idea number 2, to Zoom or not to Zoom. For example, the Torah scholars of the Talmudic era could not have imagined the reality of telephones or Zoom. To rule on modern halachic questions, today's halachic decisors, poskim, use this deep and encyclopedic knowledge of halacha to apply relevant principles from the Talmud to new technology.
Yeah, very good. So this is a big question that comes up. Let's start with, of course, COVID has changed a lot of things in our life, including the ideas of Zoom. So let's start with how this would change and where this would come up in Jewish law. And Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Share how your life has practically changed during the pandemic. Before March of 2020, no one would have guessed that social distancing and an absence of assemblage would become commonplace. Soon afterwards, though, much of the world was locked down. What kind of challenges did these restrictions pose to the Jewish community? One ramification of the lockdown was the major uptick in video conferencing as a means of virtual gathering and communication. Using Zoom for commercial mitzvot, jot down 4 video conference related halakhic questions.
So let's give a few ideas of where this would come into play. The most famous one would be the minyan. Everybody is aware that certain prayers in the synagogue, to read the Torah, to say the Kaddish, one needs a quorum of 10 men, which we'll get into the discussion later where we learned that from. But it's learned from biblical verses that when one wants to praise God it has to be with a quorum of 10 men, a group of 10 men together above the age of 13, which would be the classification in Jewish law of a man versus a boy. So then the obvious question that comes up is, when we cannot get together because of a virus, because of a spread of a pandemic, can we get together over Zoom? Does that fall into the same type of getting together? Or does Jewish law require it to be actively together in the same room, not just over the internet? Another example would be that on Purim or other holidays as well, we have to hear certain readings. Purim, we hear the Megillah reading, the story of the book of Esther. Other holidays, we would hear Torah reading. But on holidays, we don't use the internet, we don't use electricity, so therefore it wouldn't come up. On Purim, which we celebrated not too long ago, we can use electricity. So if one cannot attend a Purim party in person and they want to hear the Megillah reading over the internet, over Zoom, is that something that Jewish law allows or not? Like in every area of Jewish law, it's rarely a yes or no answer. Yes or no is very putting it in a box, and it all depends on a lot of factors, a lot of details as to why yes, why no, in which case yes, in which case no. It depends on what is the reason that you need to have a group together in the first place, and that could help us understand what would be the law regarding Zoom, if that's considered together or not. Before we get into the answers and how we dissect it, let's bring on another area, which was a big debate, discussing similar idea to Zoom, because by Zoom, you're not actually together with the person, you're hearing it through the internet. And there was a similar discussion about a microphone. What's the status of a microphone? Is it considered, this is not a discussion, is a microphone permitted on Shabbat or not? That is already a separate thing where we don't use a microphone on Shabbat because it uses electricity. However, the discussion here is a microphone considered that you're hearing the person's voice, or is the microphone considered a separate voice, a computerized voice, or electromagnetic voice, and therefore you didn't fulfill your obligation of listening to the person's voice? So let's read, Sheila, if you'd like to read while.
I don't know, you disappeared.
Oh.
The thing disappeared. Hold on. Notice some, I'll try to get it back. I don't know where it went.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Is it on your computer it disappeared, or?
Yeah, my whole computer, the screen, there's something else, the regular screen just went. You
Oh,
just
okay.
went. Let me
So-
try to, let me see if I can get it back again, sorry.
No problem. If you want, we could get back to you.
Yeah, be my guest, get back to me, no
Okay.
problem.
Okay, perfect. So Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Okay, while video conferencing is a new
Oh, I
tech.
got it.
Go ahead, Sheila.
No, go ahead, I don't know where you're up to, go ahead.
While video conferencing is a new technology, the ability to perform mitzvot over the telephone was a hotly debated topic among 20th century poskim. The microphone, a complex halakhic analysis. The order to rule on the issue, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the leading halakhic authorities of the 20th century, regularly consulted with scientists about the inner workings of new technologies. In his responsa regarding the permissibility of fulfilling mitzvot by listening to the altered human voice, such as via a microphone or telephone, he began with an extremely etude and technical description of how the phones of the day operated.
Okay, so before we get to his text, we'll get to text 4 in a moment. I just want to pull up a short clip in order to understand better how a microphone works. And from the microphone, we'll get into the Zoom, and we'll get into the question of, can one fulfill all the obligations that are normally done in person? Can they be fulfilled over Zoom? So let's pull up over here. You should be able to see.
How do microphones work? Though they have
Just
their
can you guys see the screen in here?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
How do microphones work? Though they have their differences and different uses, they are all transducers, converting sound waves to an electrical signal. The dynamic microphone is the most common used. These work using electromagnetic induction. Sound waves hit a thin diaphragm, which causes it to move. This diaphragm is attached to a coil surrounded by a magnet. This magnet creates a magnetic field around the coil. The sound waves hitting the diaphragm are moving the coil, and the coil's movement past the magnet creates an electrical current. This electrical current is your sound signal. Loudspeakers work in reverse. Here the incoming sound signal moves the coil, which in turn moves the diaphragm, creating sound waves. Want to learn more? Subscribe or check the sources.
Okay. So that's just to get an idea of what it is, how a microphone works. And now let's see inside. This is the rabbi, which of course at his time, a microphone was brand new and people didn't know. It's interesting that even scientists or people that were dealing in the field had disagreements exactly how it operates. But based on him speaking to other technicians, people that are dealing with this new technology, as well as other rabbis, he wrote a response as to what his opinion is regarding the microphone. Now, to clarify, what we'll see from here is that a rabbi that wants to deal with how to view new technologies needs to be well-versed in two areas. They need to be really well-versed in the Jewish law in all other areas in order to know what to compare it to. And they need to be well-versed in the new technologies. They have to be understanding as to how things operate in order to know what to compare it to. If they just say, oh, this looks like a microphone operates a certain way, but they don't really understand the inner workings, it would be foolish and probably they would make a mistake if they were to then decide if it's allowed or not. So let's read his response regarding a microphone. And Elia, if you'd like to read text number 4.
The microphone. Oh, like the first, or just text number 4?
Yeah.
Okay, a microphone picks up sound waves and converts them into electric currents. The changes in current over time, as well as the volume of the current, are typical of the sounds absorbed by the microphone. This lid, called a membrane, is attached to charcoal grains located inside a tin box. Through the membrane and the coal passes a current from an electric battery or from the grid. Since the coal is a good conductor and the current passes through it easily, when the grains are dense and press nicely to each other, then the current is strong, and if they touch each other only weakly, then the current is slight. The current shocks from the microphone are usually amplified by the electronic amplifier and transmitted to distances by means of wires, such as a telephone or wirelessly, for example, on a radio. A sound or headphone is that it contains a coil that surrounds iron and it becomes a magnet when it passes through a coil. The magnet attracts a thin, flexible tin membrane. The force of attraction of the magnet depends on the degree of current passing through the coil. When the current is strong, its magnetism is weak.
Yeah.
And that part?
Yeah, so just before you read that, so basically what he's describing is people didn't know this. A lot of people, when microphones first came out, they thought that actually the person's voice is traveling through, and somehow like you make those handheld speakers that they used to have out of paper, where it's just really narrow and then it gets wider and it's your voice just being amplified. People thought that's the way microphones work. So he explains here that actually a microphone is not your voice traveling through the wire and just somehow getting broadcasted in a louder way, but a microphone is copying your voice, turning it into an electric magnetic wave, and then reforming an exact copy of your voice. So it sounds exactly like your voice, even though two different people speaking in a microphone has two different sounds. Each one, when they speak, it sounds like their voice. That's because the microphone knows how to perfectly copy it. However, it's not your voice that is coming out on the other end. It is from the microphone, from the speaker system. It's something brand new, an electrical magnetic voice. So therefore, now that he establishes that it's not your voice, now he could go ahead and say, okay, therefore in Jewish law, how does a microphone play out? Can a microphone be used or not? Let's discuss. Do I need to hear your original voice or not? So continue reading. Elia, if you'd like to read the next page, does this
or other processes that transform a human voice into an electronic or digital format suffice for the fulfillment of mitzvot? If I am listening to someone reading the Megillah, I must hear his original voice, or is a must I hear his original voice, or is a technologically generated replica also sufficient? To resolve this question, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach analyzed dozens of Talmudic sources that discuss the precise relationship between a speaker and a listener, even if they are both present, and the rulings associated with them. For example, one relevant source speaks about someone who is standing on the ground and hears the sound of a shofar emerging from a pit.
Yeah, very good. Okay, and then read text 5, because this is part of the flow.
All right. If one sounds a shofar into a pit or into a cistern or into a large jug, if he clearly heard the sound of the shofar, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if he heard the sound of an echo, he has not fulfilled his obligation. In our cases of the telephone.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going. In our cases of the telephone and microphone, even though the sound originates from a human and sounds like a human voice, it isn't enough to fulfill a halachic obligation, because the sound that is heard is not the original sound waves that emerge from the speaker, but an electronic replica.
Very good. So just to clarify, so everybody's on the same page here and we don't get lost with what's going on. So we'll get back to the Zoom question, but he had a question regarding the microphone, and he says, let's look at cases. Of course, I didn't have a microphone back in the day, but he says, if I could study all the cases in the Talmud that I think might be applicable to learn out a lesson, he finds a great example. This is something that was around those days. They had echoes. He said, the Talmud clearly says that if one blows the shofar in a pit, and he or others over there, if they heard the direct sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, we have to hear the shofar blowing, they fulfilled their obligation. However, if it was a pit that has a really bad echo, and therefore the people did not hear the sound of the shofar itself, but only the sound of the echo, they haven't fulfilled their obligation. Clearly, this law, if once they find it and you say, hey, can this apply to the case of a microphone? The answer is yes, this seems very similar. The microphone is also not the original voice. It's like a copy of the original voice. And yes, it's only coming about because the human spoke. But just because it's coming about because of him doesn't mean it's his voice. Just like when you blow into a pit or you blow into a huge barrel, it's not your voice. They might be hearing the voice of the echo, even though it's only coming about because of you. Nevertheless, the Talmud rules that one has not fulfilled their obligation. So the Talmud says clearly that you have to hear the original voice. Therefore, from this law, I can learn out that a microphone is also problematic, and one cannot fulfill their obligation on something that they need to hear the original voice by using a microphone. So this is an example where a modern day rabbi, this rabbi, he passed away already by now, but he was alive not too long ago. When microphones come around, again, he doesn't say, well, microphones are not discussed in the Talmud, so we have nothing to say about it. He says, of course, the ideas are discussed in the Talmud. We just have to find where it is. And this is one example of many. His response is pages and pages long, and there's many other rabbis that discuss it with him, and some are debating certain aspects of it. But for the sake of keeping it simple, here is an easy part taken out from his response where we can see the example in the Talmud. Let's move on to continuing over here with the next text. And Caroline, if you'd like to read text number 6.
Minchach Shlomo Ibid. From the description above of how a microphone works, it would appear that one who hears the sound of a shofar or the recitation of a Megillat Esther throughout a telephone or a microphone did not fulfill his obligation. Even if we argue that the sound is not changed and therefore it is not similar to a shofar sounding from within a pit. The reason for this is that one is only considered to have heard the sound of the shofar if one's ears pick up the sound waves directly from the blower. This is not the case when the ear hears the movement of a membrane, even if this device is able to replicate the precise sound of a shofar. The person hearing the sound of the shofar, the person is hearing the sound of the membrane moving, not the sound of the shofar.
Beautiful. So he says, the Torah says that you should hear the shofar blowing on Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, if one hears a recording or even from a microphone, a speaker system of a shofar blowing, they haven't fulfilled their obligation because they didn't hear shofar blowing. The Torah doesn't want you to only hear a sound that sounds like a shofar. It wants you to literally hear the sound of a shofar blowing. So therefore, he clearly proved his idea from this example of law that we know in the Talmud. Now he goes into this a little deeper to understand where this comes from, and this will help us in future cases. Sheila, if you'd like to read, how does, and then we'll read text number 7.
How does Rabbi Shlomo Zalman know that one must hear the sound directly from the, is there another word at the from something? I can't see.
Yeah,
that.
let me
From, I don't know, from.
Let me zoom out
okay.
here.
Now I see it. From the one producing it. Why would an electric or digital replica not suffice? One of his proofs is from the following halakha in the Shalachim Arak. But first, 2 pieces of background information. Consider the following scenario. A group of people are praying in a certain spot and someone else stands a little further away. He can see and hear everything that goes on and therefore should be able to participate in parts of the prayer that need to be heard. For example, answering the leader during the Kedusha prayer. The only issue is that animal excrement is between him and the group. There's the fact that the sound must travel over an area where it is prohibited to pray impact the ability for the individual listener to participate?
Very good. So before we get to text 7, let me just clarify. So he says, where do we know that you need to hear the actual voice? So let's start with 2 laws. One law is that a person has to pray in a clean area. It's not respectful to God to pray to him in a place where there's excrement, and therefore a person must make sure not to pray in a bathroom or even near an area where, if it's a dog or a cat or anything else, had some litter over there. Another law is that people must pray in an area together where they can hear the chazan, the one in charge, the cantor, the leader, say certain parts, and then when there's 10 men together, everybody can say the rest of the prayers and respond appropriately. Each section, whether it's the Kaddish or the Kedusha prayer, there are certain paragraphs that are added when we have a minyan. So then the question would be, let's read over here the quote in the Shulchan Aruch. And Sheila, if you'd like to read text number 7.
If there were 10 people in one location, they can recite Kaddish and Kedusha, and even someone who is not standing with them can respond. Others say that there cannot be animal excrement or an idolatrous item separating them.
Yeah, very good. So
Yeah.
the question is, does the spirituality fly over these prohibited areas, or does it get stopped by them? So if you had a minyan where the synagogue was too full, too many people came, and some people had to stand outside, everybody agrees that they can answer. Once you have 10 people together, those that hear it outside can answer as well. But then the question is, what happens if in between where the minion is and this person is, there's this break, sort of like, think of it in a term of Wi-Fi, when you have Wi-Fi in your home, but then you have this certain type of brick wall that's a very thick wall, and it blocks the Wi-Fi from traveling through. So the question is, spiritual blockage, which is something that is a prohibited area where one is not allowed to pray. Do I say that even though you're standing far away, no one is standing next to the prohibited item, but the voice is traveling over this area? So maybe because in the area where the voice had to travel, one cannot pray, anybody that hears it after that area, further down south from this area where it's prohibited, also cannot answer. So the Shulchan Aruch brings an opinion that says that it is prohibited because in order to answer, you have to be able, from the area where it was said till the area where you're answering, it had to be an appropriate, permissible area. Once it goes through, it travels through an area that's prohibited, anyone afterwards cannot answer. Okay, let's continue reading over here. Eliyahu, if you'd like to read, there is an opinion.
There is an opinion cited in Shulchan Aruch that the waist in the middle creates a halachic barrier, and the listener does not fulfill his obligation. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach derives a general principle from this halacha. The listeners must have direct connection to the one producing the sound. This directly impacts the modern issue of fulfilling a mitzvah by hearing an electronically created voice. The basis for this halacha, that the excrement is a barrier, is that once there is something that breaks the direct continuum between the one reciting and the blessing, the one reciting the blessing and the one listening, the relationship between them is broken. Even though in the case of the excrement, that this is only one opinion and it is unclear what the final ruling should be. Nonetheless, that is because the sound waves travel over the excrement, and it is only a halachic barrier. However, in our case of the microphone and telephone, there is a complete disconnect between the speaker and the listener, as the sound emanating from the speaker disappears and is transformed into an electric current that is impossible to be heard, and it is then transformed back through a magnet and a membrane to sound waves. Therefore, it is reasonable to assert that the relationship between the speaker and the listener is completely severed.
Very good. So this is, hopefully everyone's following along his logic. It's not that a rabbi is asked, can you use a microphone? And he says, I think, yeah, I think no, and just random, just my own opinion. He has to base it on what laws did you find? Let's first establish, does Jewish law require that one literally hear the original voice or not? So once we can compare to other scenarios and say, yes, Jewish law requires that you hear it directly and requires that there's no break. So in a case of the excrement, in a case of what an animal lays out from after it's eating and digesting its food, that is a debate, because one can say, I heard their actual voice and it's just a spiritual barrier. It's a halachic barrier, meaning there wasn't really no break in the sound. It's just in between where I was standing and the person that generated the voice, there is something that makes it problematic to pray there. However, in a case where there is no actual voice traveling, it's just a copy from the sound waves, then everybody would agree, I didn't hear the original voice, and therefore one has to rehear it or go to the location where they can hear the original voice because they didn't fulfill their obligation. Very good. So now let's go back to the question we started off in the beginning regarding the Megillah on Purim, the holiday where one wants to hear the Megillah. So Caroline, if you'd like to read.
The Megillah, how does this all factor into the question of a person quarantining over Purim and hearing the Megillah being read over Zoom? Rabbi Shlomo Avenir, an Israeli halakhic decisor with 10 volumes of Reposa to his name, offered his recommendations. Text number 9, Rabbi Shlomo Avenir, Megillah reading by telephone or video. Question: Can a person in quarantine fulfill the mitzvah of hearing Megillah over the telephone or by video? Answer, Rabbi Herschel Schlachter was asked this question and said that Igrot Moshe Orach Chaim, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein rules that literally one cannot fulfill hearing the Megillah over the telephone or through a microphone. However, in a pressing situation, one can fulfill this mitzvah over the telephone or through a microphone, since it is a rabbinic mitzvah. This is also the opinion of Strut Taziz Eliezer 811. In Mishnot Shlomo 1:9, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach disagrees. In our case, since it is impossible to hear the Megillah in person because it is a life-threatening situation caused by coronavirus, it is permissible to hear the Megillah being live phone call or video. The chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi David Lau, ruled, however, that one does not fulfill the mitzvah in this manner.
Yeah, very good. So let's just clarify what we're quoting over here. So this is an answer that a rabbi gave regarding can one hear the Megillah over Zoom. So it's not just that the rabbis, each one makes up his own opinion without any sources, but rather each one studies the sources and says, based on my understanding of previous laws regarding hearing the actual voice, I believe that a telephone or microphone or Zoom doesn't work, doesn't qualify. And the other rabbis agree, and they say, yes, you're right, it's not the same. However, in circumstances where there is nothing better, they say, since it is a rabbinic mitzvah, which means biblical commandments, one has to be more strict. Rabbinic mitzvahs, something that the rabbis instituted, for example, the story of Purim, which wasn't around in the times of Moses, it only happened later. So the rabbis instituted to read the Megillah. Whenever it's something that the rabbis impose, one can be slightly more lenient in certain aspects of it, according to Jewish law. This is a law that the rabbis instituted with all of their new laws that they implemented. They said that whenever it comes to a case of a doubt regarding their laws, one can take the more lenient opinion because it's only rabbinic. So some rabbis say, because this is rabbinic and there is no better option, meaning if there was a possibility for one to hear in person, everybody agrees they should hear in person. The question is, if it's either you won't hear or you'll hear over Zoom. So this is where there's the discussion, and we don't bring all the sources here of the back and forth of different opinions, but we get a better picture as to why the rabbis are disagreeing. It's not just random, but they're saying, based on previous laws, will this apply in this case, that one can listen through the internet or through a phone or not? Okay, let's read. Sheila, if you'd like to read note and then summary for section number 2.
We are not trying to give a halakhic ruling in this lesson. There are clearly differing, I don't know if there's another word, opinions. Each individual should consult his or her rabbi and follow their tradition. The point of this lesson is simply to demonstrate how ancient principles can be applied to modern times. We have covered big idea number 2. For example, the Torah scholars of the Talmudic era could not have imagined that reality of telephones or Zoom. To rule on modern halakha questions, today's halakha decisors poskim use their deep and encyclopedic knowledge of halakha to apply relevant principles from the Talmud to new technology. In the following section, we will explore the third and the final big idea.
Beautiful. Okay, so that's section number 2. Let's move on to section number 3. And Eliaf, you'd like to start.
Section 3. Extrapolating halakha to every scenario, a Zoom case study. Applying halakhic principles often leads to nuanced results. The answer to modern questions won't always be a simple yes or no, but will depend on the situation's unique details.
Okay, so let's start with a question, which is different than the question before, and we'll explain why. And this again goes back to the same idea where when one understands the background, they'll understand that not every case is comparable to the other. So Elia, if you'd like to continue reading, minion over Zoom.
Minion over Zoom. Can one use Zoom to create a minion? There are many reasons why praying with the minion is usually the best way to pray, and each of them must be traced to its Talmudic source to understand the ideas at play. The question has nothing to do with the voice being digitally telecommunicated, because in the case of praying together, that's not the problem. Here we are asking if it's possible to count people who aren't physically present, but can hear and see services as a quorum. So while the question sounds similar, the perimeters are completely different. This just demonstrates how a deep knowledge of the reasoning and nuance behind the halacha serves not only the need to apply it to modern cases, but also to explore how to apply it to various scenarios to develop a nuanced approach that avoids yes/no binaries. One benefit of praying with a minion is that there are certain parts of the prayer service, like Kaddish, which can only be recited with a minion. The halacha is codified in Shulchan Aruch. Should I read the text 10?
Yeah, please.
Kaddish is recited. It is not said with less than 10 males. This rule applies for Kedusha and Baruch Hu, that are not said with less than a quorum. Would a virtual gathering over Zoom allow for recitation of Kaddish?
Yeah, very good. So let's start again to explain over here. So the question is, it sounds similar to the previous case. However, once we discuss what is the reason that a minion needs 10 men present, and what is it that allows us to be said when we have a minion, we can understand if there's any benefit in having a minion over Zoom. So point number one is from a quote from Shulchan Aruch. Let's read in Proto-Jewish law. It says that you need to have 10 men there. So would a virtual gathering work? Let's read what Jewish law says clearly regarding if not everybody is together, meaning that you have to, once you have 10 together, to clarify, the rest can be elsewhere as long as they hear. But the question is, if you don't even have 10 together, does that work? So let's read, Sheila, if you'd like to read text 11.
All 10 people must be in one place and the prayer leader with them. One who stands in the middle of the doorway between a part of the building and outside, such as when one closes the door. One is in a place from the outside, lip of the thickness of the door and outwards. It is considered outside.
Yeah, so clearly Jewish law says that if one is even standing with the door open, but he's in the area where once I close the door, he will be outside, he's already considered outside. That's how strict it is, that everybody has to be together in the same room, same area, same open space. Okay, continue reading, Sheila.
As we can see, even when you literally hear the other people, if you are not in the same room, Kaddish cannot be recited. Is there any value then in having services over Zoom? Rabbi Asher Weiss, a noted halakha authority in Jerusalem and the head posek for medical issues at Sherazai Zadek Hospital, argue that there is value in holding services over Zoom.
Right. So let's clarify from the first aspect of why we want a minion, meaning this is here, this section is teaching us how to dissect the question, look back at the sources and come to the conclusion. So when one asks, can I do a minion over Zoom? We say, well, let's look, what's the reason for getting a minion in order to say certain parts of the prayer? Jewish law says that to do that, everybody needs to be in the same room. So regarding this aspect that we read in text 10 and 11, Zoom will not help. It wouldn't do any good because not everybody is together. They're just hearing each other, but it's not even real voices that they're hearing. It's hearing it over the computer, and therefore you're not together in the same room. However, he says, let's understand what other reasons are there to have a minion. And maybe for those reasons, it does help over Zoom. So let's continue. Caroline, if you'd like to read, he reached. Oh, you're on mute. Let's unmute a second.
Okay, sorry.
Here we go.
Let's see. One thing, okay, he reasoned, I got the black box. Okay. One thing a minion accomplishes is that it allows the recitation of certain parts of the service. I'll start over because okay. He
No,
reached this conclusion
Yeah.
after studying Talmudic sources that discuss the different reasons and aspects of praying with the minion. One thing a minion accomplishes is that it allows the recitation of certain parts of the service. What is the connection between a minion and these prayers? The Talmud teaches that when a minion is praying together, God himself descends to be present. Text 11. From where is it derived that 10 people who pray, the divine presence is with them? As it is stated, God stands in the congregation of God, and the minimum number of people that constitute a congregation is a minion of 10. If this is all we had to go with, it would follow that 10 people must be physically present in the same room in order to host the divine presence. Zoom would not suffice. However, Rabbi Weiss argues that there is additional benefit to praying with a quorum. One's prayers are not readily answered. The Talmud teaches that God does not reject the prayers of the congregation of people.
Very good. So before we read number 12, he says, besides for what we mentioned earlier, that certain prayers can only be said when we have 10, we have an additional aspect that God is present. Now, this presence of God, yes, is there when there's 10 people together. However, there's another aspect where God is more readily available to answer a prayer when multiple people, 10, are praying together. And on that part, if 10 people are praying together at the same time, even if they're not in the same location, so it's not as good as praying together, but because simultaneously they're all praying, God accepts that prayer better, quicker, and more favorably because it's simultaneously many people are asking at the same time. It's like a politician won't answer when one person requests something, but if there's a lot of pressure from many people in his jurisdiction to want something, they're more likely to respond. So too with God, he loves it when there is a prayer of multiple people together. That aspect of prayer, one of the reasons why we do prayer with a minion, with 10 people, that aspect can be accomplished even when it's over Zoom, because yes, you're not all together and God's presence isn't there in a more revealed way, but you are all doing it simultaneously and the prayers will be answered quicker. Let's read text number 12. And Elia, if you'd like to read text number 12.
Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, what is the meaning of that which is written? But as for me, let my prayer be unto you, God, in a time of favor. When is a time of favor? It is at the time when the congregation is praying. Rabbi Yosei, son of Rabbi Hanina, said that the unique quality of communal prayer is derived from here. Thus said God, in a time of acceptance, I have answered you, and on a day of salvation, I have aided you. Rabbi Acha, son of Rabbi Hanina, said that, somebody's calling. Son of Rabbi Hanina, said that it is derived from here. Behold, God is mighty. He despises no one, the community. And it is written, he has redeemed my soul in peace so that none came upon me, for there were many with me. God shall hear and answer them. This verse teaches that the prayer was answered because there were so many with me when it was offered.
Very good. So this is the quote in the Talmud from where we learn out that when there's a prayer together, that's when it's accepted in a greater way, and it's bringing proofs from the verses of the Torah. The Torah and the prophets or Psalms is one of the proofs that God answers the prayer when it's said all together. So from here, we see clearly that at the same time praying together is something that's beneficial. And here I'll say this quote outside, text number 13. It says that if one cannot pray in the synagogue, they should at least pray the same time that the synagogue is praying. Likewise, if someone missed the prayer at the synagogue, they should, even if they're praying by themselves, they couldn't pray at the same time, they should pray in the synagogue. So we see that there's still some significance with praying at the same time together. Let's move on to text number 14. And Sheila, if you'd like to read.
In conclusion, even though this situation is unprecedented and there aren't any direct proofs one way or another, it appears proper to establish a specific time that everyone should pray individually in their homes. In my opinion, it is possible to do it in such a way that they can all pray together and hear each other, and one of them will act as if he is the cousin prayer leader of the congregation, and he will pray aloud. This is a proper course of conduct, even though it is clear that they cannot join together to create a halakha quorum to recite the parts of the service that require a quorum. Nonetheless, they gain the value of praying at the same time as the congregation.
Very good. So to clarify, he says it's not obligatory to make a minyan over Zoom. And 10 people praying together cannot recite the Torah reading or Kaddish or Kedusha, the parts that are normally said only when we have a minyan. However, there is still the benefit of praying simultaneously, which is one of the things that we get when we're praying in the synagogue. But when we don't have that option, second to best would be to coordinate that everyone's praying at the same time. Let's read another example of Birkat HaGomel. Birkat HaGomel is anyone that was saved from a dangerous situation says a special blessing. And Caroline, if you'd like to read.
Brecha HaGomel over Zoom. One more scenario requires, or at least preferable to have, a quorum in the recitation of Brecha HaGomel. What is HaGomel? 4 types of people need to thank God by reciting the HaGomel blessing: those who traverse an ocean and those who traverse a desert once they reach civilization, a dangerously ill patient who has recovered, and someone who was released from captivity.
Very good. Okay, continue.
Have to move it up. I can't. Okay, there. What blessing does he recite? Blessed are you, Lord our God, master of the world, who bestows good upon the unworthy, who has bestowed all good upon me. The listeners respond, he who bestowed all good upon you, he should continue to bestow you with all good. One needs to recite this blessing in the presence of 10 people. If he recites the blessing without the presence of 10 people, some say that he fulfilled his obligation, and some say he did not fulfill his obligation. Therefore, it is proper to recite it again in the presence of 10 people, but without mentioning God's name, lest one violate the prohibition of taking God's name in vain.
Very good. So here he says in the Shulchan Aruch, one should make this blessing, thanking God for taking him out of harm's way. He should say it with 10 people. And if he said it with less than 10 people present, then some say he fulfilled, some say he didn't, and it's better to say the blessing again, but don't say God's name because you might be saying it in vain. Okay, let's continue with this commentary. Eliah, if you'd like to read.
Oh wait. Oh, never mind. The Mishnah Berurah, major commentary on Shulchan Aruch, writes that one may wait up to 30 days after the event to try and recite the blessing in the presence of 10 people. If no opportunity presents itself within that time, then one should recite the blessing alone. If a person knows that keep it going, right?
Yeah.
If a person knows that he will not have the opportunity to recite the blessing in the presence of 10 people, then he can recite the blessing alone. One should wait for 30 days after the opportunity to recite the blessing in the presence of 10 people. If no opportunity arises, he should recite the blessing alone after 30 days. What about
Right. Yeah, continue. No, continue.
what about reciting the blessing in the virtual presence of 10 people? Does that suffice to fulfill the requirements set out in Shulchan Aruch? Based on the above, that Zoom does not suffice for the parts of the prayer service that requires a quorum, and all of the congregants need to be in the same place in order to host the divine presence. It would seem that the answer would be no. Rabbi Herschel Schachter, a senior halachic authority at Yeshiva University, issued a ruling that a virtual quorum can suffice for Birkat Hagomel. His rationale is that the recitation of the blessing in the presence of a minyan is not linked to the attendance of the divine presence. Here's why.
Okay, and continue reading text 17.
The Talmud asks, what blessing does he recite? Rav Yehuda said, blessed is who bestows acts of loving kindness. Abai said that he must offer thanks before 10 people. As it is written in the same chapter, let them exalt him also in the congregation of the people and praise him in the assembly of the elders. The word congregation indicates a group of at least 10. And the reason for requiring 10 people for the recitation of Birkat Hagomel in the offering of a public praise, then a virtual gathering over Zoom would suffice, argues Rabbi Schachter.
Yeah.
After citing the above sources, he concludes.
Very good. So we'll read text 18 in a second. So now, just to recap, in case anybody got lost with all these different texts, the point is trying to bring out how when we have a question, it's not, well, this could be done, that could be done. Comparing randomly without understanding the reasoning, where one can say, well, we can't do a minyan over Zoom, we can't do the blessing of Hagomel over Zoom. Well, what is the reason that a minyan needs Zoom? What is the reason that a minyan needs 10 people together? And then I could say, what's the reason that the Birkat Hagomel, thanking God, needs 10 people? And it actually doesn't need 10 people. It could be done alone if one doesn't have 10. It's better with 10 people to publicize the miracle. So for that reason, it could be done even if not everybody is in the same place. So this is an example where the same applies to all questions in halacha. It is not random that people just make up their opinions. They're looking back, just like a lawyer would do, looking back at the sources, looking back at the laws. Why is this put in place? What were the details written up about it regarding this specific law? And then I know what could apply in other cases and what doesn't. Let's read text 18. Shiva, if you'd like to read.
Barak Hagomel is meant to be recited in the presence of a minyan. It is best to recite this blessing within 3 days of recovering from a potentially life-threatening situation, and it is improper to delay beyond 30 days. If it becomes clear that the word is that due to the danger, it will be impossible to be in the presence of a minyan within 30 days, then one should cite the bracha over Zoom or phone conference with 10 men watching or listening. This is possible because the requirement for a minyan is not the same as for praying with the minyan or reading the Torah that require a minyan gathered in one place. In the case of the Barak Hagomel, the purpose of the minyan is to publicize the miracle, and this can be accomplished even if the 10 individuals are listening without being present in one room.
Beautiful. Okay, and let's just, if you'd like to read the last paragraph, and then we'll go to the summary.
As we have seen, the simple question of the halachic status of a communal prayer over Zoom can't be answered with a straightforward yes or no. A tour through the Talmud reveals many angles, perspectives, and possibilities on the role of the quorum in prayer. For some of these functions, Zoom can suffice, but others require the physical presence of 10 people. The complexity of these questions requires a community to turn to the premier experts of the halakha to rule how to navigate these new situations.
Very good. So this is hopefully giving us a better understanding as to what it is that modern halacha is doing. Let's read the summary. Sheila, if you'd like to read the summary as well.
We have covered the third and final big idea. Applying halakha principles often leads to nuanced results. The answer to modern questions won't always be a simple yes or no, but will depend on the situation's unique details.
Okay, let's read the key points. We'll start with, we have here, Eliaf, if you'd like to read key points number 1 through 5.
The Torah is eternal and forever relevant. 2, the Talmud and Halakha are not just a collection of laws, but a series of underlying principles. 3, based on its foundation, Halakha can be applied to all modern scenarios and technologies. 4, as an example, Halakha can answer the questions of whether or not the obligation of hearing the Megillah can be fulfilled over Zoom. And 5, Halakha would have a more nuanced approach to whether or not there is any value to a prayer service over Zoom.
Yes, so this is the first idea we were mentioning, that the Torah lasts forever through all the generations. It has what to share, and it has halacha regarding new developments can be learned based on previous information that we had from scenarios that were around, like for example, a pit, which they had back in the day. So the key points for this class are, bottom line, the differences that we'll have in the scenarios that come about in each and every new generation is not that someone is just thinking randomly, but someone is comparing it to previous scenarios. Okay, with that, we'll conclude this class. Thank you all for joining. It was a pleasure. And we will see you again next week.
Thank you. Enjoy
Lila
your
Tov, Lahitha Road.
Thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.